Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 73 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Chicago Blackhawks, in which the Sharks have lost 5-4 in the shootout. An eighth straight loss for the Sharks, and officially, we've got some really bad news here. The Sharks are officially out of the playoff race. They mathematically cannot make it into a playoff spot. I know a lot of people were holding out hope, especially with how great the Sharks have looked over these last 8 games. I mean, 8 losses in a row. Not many teams can manage to pull that off in a single season, but the Sharks have done so. And yet, unfortunately, the Sharks still going to miss the playoffs with that. Moving on into this game, generally the Sharks didn't actually play terribly. There was obviously a really slow start to this game. The Sharks gave up the first goal. That was to Patrick Kane within just the first minute or two. And in the first 4 or 5 minutes of this one, it was just all Blackhawks. The Sharks did not look ready to start. But eventually, as time went on, the Sharks started looking better and played a, I would say, pretty decent game. Now, it should be noted that the Blackhawks are also not a very good team at all, are also not going to be making it to the playoffs, and so the Sharks having a competitive game with the Blackhawks isn't something that's super impressive. It's kind of more so expected, but still nice to see at the very least. The Sharks would tie the game up in the first off of a Timo Meier goal, his 32nd of the year, as he continues to set these new career highs, and we would head into the second period with the game tied at 1. In the second, the Blackhawks would take the lead back 2-1. The Sharks would tie it again off of a Scott Reedy goal to make it 2-2 before the Blackhawks would get a Calvin DeHaan 4-on-4 late second period goal to make it 3-2, and that would be the score heading into the third. So the Sharks would have to win the third period to be able to win this game. And, well, it didn't start off necessarily super well. The Blackhawks would score the first goal of that final frame, and they would put themselves up by a score of 4-2, but the Sharks would respond quite well, I must say. Both of these goals are hard-working goals. Both of these goals are coming off of the Sharks really kind of pelting shots on net, so nothing super lucky, I would say, with either of these two goals. Hard work is kind of the way that they got here. So Balcers made it 4-3, cut the lead to 1, and then Megna would score his second of this season to tie the game up at 4. We would then head to the overtime, a place where the Sharks have struggled significantly as of late after they had started the season extremely successful in the 3-on-3 play. I believe they had started at 3-0 or maybe even 4-0. They now have a total, including this game, of 9 overtime losses, or actually 8 overtime losses, because this game does not count since it was a shootout loss. But still, the 3-on-3, there was maybe one decent rush chance for the Sharks, but then there was also a terrible giveaway by Eric, or not a terrible giveaway, but a very bad play by Erik Karlsson in his own defensive zone. He just allowed DeBrincat to walk right by him, and it wasn't even a situation where it's usually the Erik Karlsson problem, where he goes wide. He kind of just walked right through him. Karlsson got it lost in his skates a bit, and DeBrincat got a great chance, but the game would not end in overtime. Instead, it would go to the shootout. The Sharks would have their 3 shots. Karlsson, Couture, and Hertl, all 3 would miss, and the Blackhawks would only need the single goal from, I believe it was DeBrincat, if I'm not mistaken, to win this game. Moving on to the players to talk about, once again, the first line is reunited. Meier, Hertl, and Barabanov, and surprise, surprise, they actually look very strong here tonight. Managed a couple of goals, the Meier goal, obviously, but also the later on Megna goal started off with a great chance from Barabanov, who got himself robbed by the Blackhawks goaltender Lankinen, and then a great chance for Meier, who also got robbed by Lankinen, and then finally the great chance for Megna, who was able to put it in to tie this game. So generally just a fantastic game from this Sharks first line, but that's really not news. The question is, how do the other 3 lines look? And the answer is not terrible. Like I said, this was a not so great Blackhawks team, so it's not a surprise that there was a competitive matchup between the Sharks and Chicago. However, it's not as though these 3 lines did anything to write home about either. I was very surprised to see the second line be sort of broken up. I mentioned in my previous review of the game the other night against the Predators that the Chmelevski, Couture, Balcers line looked pretty good in that third period, and even though I did criticize Chmelevski somewhat for not necessarily fitting in super well on that particular line. I thought they played decent enough to keep the line together, but Bob Booner seemed to agree with me enough that he ended up moving Chmelevski down to the third line. But another reason why I didn't really want to see this is because your option for putting on the second line is then Nick Bonino as Couture's winger. That just seems like an extremely odd choice in my opinion. I mean, Bonino is the third line center, and I remember earlier on this season there was a quote from Bonino that he did not want to play wing for this team, and yet he was put into that position for absolutely zero reason. I don't think that this increased the chances of the Sharks winning, and even so, do you really need to increase the chance of the Sharks winning? If I was really making the option of, hey, do I want to play Chmelevski more in an exposed role as a younger player, or do I want to have Bonino play in a completely off role for absolutely zero reason, I would likely choose Chmelevski on that second line, but then I'm not the head coach of the San Jose Sharks. Speaking of Chmelevski's line, he was on the third line with Gregor and Nieto, which also looked okay here tonight, I would say. But again, surprising that the third line for the Sharks was broken up after a pretty solid performance against the Predators. I thought the Bonino, Nieto, Gregor line was quite good and potentially the Sharks' best line as a whole over that 60-minute game against the Predator, 65-minute game if you want to count the overtime, but realistically the 60 minutes that they actually played at even strength or in regulation, and yet it was still separated because Bonino was pushed up, and I just don't really think it necessarily worked as well. Like I said, it wasn't bad. There was no really bad lines for the Sharks, I would say, here tonight, but the third line, I would think, could have been slightly better. When it comes to the fourth line, it's a bit awkward because the Sharks decided to once again go with an 11 forward, 7 defenseman setup, and so it was Viel and Reedy being joined by Radim Shemek on the wing. Now, I don't really have any comments about Shemek as he played very little in this game. I believe left with an injury, so he only had about 3 minutes of ice time tonight. And so when it comes to an actual fourth line, it's kind of, you can't really judge them, especially since Viel also got less than 7 minutes on the night because he got into some fights and things like that. But in the end, Scott Reedy did score, so that is a positive, even though it wasn't necessarily some sort of amazing goal, and it was one that he got extremely lucky on for it to deflect off of Calvin DeHaan in front and then get past Lankinen. But still, I guess it's a positive. I was just a bit surprised not only to see Dahlin come out of the lineup just to run a 7 defenseman, 11 forward setup, but also that one of those 7 defensemen didn't end up being Ryan Merkley, but I'll get to that a bit later. So on to the defensemen, Burns and Megna as the first pairing, but as the game went on, it seemed as though the Sharks started trending a bit more towards the Burns-Ferraro setup and leaving Megna with Karlsson. But speaking of Jacob Megna, I haven't really mentioned him much over these past few games, and I've been solely focusing on Brent Burns for many of them. But I do want to mention Megna here tonight because he had a bit of a standout play earlier on in a bad way when he kind of got deked out by Patrick Kane, ended up falling over and allowed for a good Blackhawks chance, but he sort of recovered from that situation extremely well. Funnily enough, a few minutes later, it would be Megna pulling a nice spinorama move on Patrick Kane himself to get the puck past him and push it out of the Sharks' own defensive zone. And then from then on, Megna played a very solid defensive game and an even pretty decent offensive game, did score this goal here tonight, so I was actually rather impressed by number 24. When it comes to the second pairing, like I said, it was a bit of a mishmash between these two first pairings, but I can talk about Erik Karlsson, who was extremely effective on the offensive side of things here tonight, which was nice to see considering he hasn't really been as such over these past couple of games, but the defense was still a big struggle here tonight. Like I mentioned, there was that overtime play where he just allowed DeBrincat to go right by him to get a great chance on Reimer, and generally there were a couple of really bad giveaways as well in the defensive zone, and so it wasn't an amazing game from Karlsson, but if you're looking solely at the offensive side of things, he played quite well. When it comes to the third pairing, and this is where I said I was going to mention Ryan Merkley, because for whatever reason, instead of continuing the sort of situation of going between Miloš and Merkley game in and game out that Bob Booner had gotten into the habit of doing, Miloš actually got a second straight game, and it's made weirder by the fact that Miloš didn't actually play well in the previous one against Nashville. In fact, his pairing for like the third straight time was the worst for the San Jose Sharks. Is it a surprise that the Sharks' third pairing is going to be their third best pairing? No, but it was substantially worse than the other two pairings. And when it's two defensive defensemen, yeah, you're probably going to take some icings. Yeah, you're probably going to play in your zone a bit, but you're expecting to not necessarily give up so many chances, and yet it seems as though it's kind of open season whenever these two players are on the ice. I mean, I believe it was Miloš on the ice for when the Blackhawks scored their tic-tac-toe goal, which was just way too many passes that were allowed to get through the first pass. Sure, obviously it's up high. The second pass, you kind of want to be able to block that one, but if you don't block that one, you got to block the third pass. Nobody did, and so the Blackhawks were able to get that easy goal from Dylan Strome. But generally, it was just not a good game from this third pairing. I don't know what Miloš did in the Nashville game to deserve a second straight game, but once again, this third pairing was not good here tonight. So I would hope, at the very least, that Merkley should be able to find his way into the lineup for the next game on Saturday. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Saturday, where they will take on the Dallas Stars once more. Joe Pavelski once more. The last time these two teams played, the Sharks struggled in the first period against them, giving up 4 goals, but actually ended up making it a rather interesting game by the end. Of course, they would end up losing, and it's possible that that does still happen and we extend the losing streak to 9 come Saturday, but we'll see if they can finally break out of it. Class dismissed.